Well, Christmas and gift giving seem to go hand in hand. And it's not just a modern phenomenon. We read in John 3:16 that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. So Christmas started with giving. Joseph gave his pledge, "Mary, I will stay with you." The wise men came and brought their gifts. Think about Mary. What did she give? She gave her womb and she gave her future. And of course, now in our day and age, we give gifts all the time, especially at Christmas. We spend money, we spend time, we look and search for the perfect gift, then we spend money wrapping them and putting bows on them because gift giving and Christmas are so entwined. I don't know if we could imagine one without the other. But there's a gift that's given at Christmas that I think is so often overlooked. It's the gift of worship. So I want to read one section from the Gospel of Luke, and it says this: suddenly, so now if you're familiar with the story, the shepherds had been there in the field watching their flocks, and an angel appears, declares to them the coming birth of Messiah, that Messiah had been born, that Jesus, the Christ, had been born. And then it says this: suddenly a great company of heavenly hosts appeared with the angel. So just a cacophony of noise as this group of angels begin praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest heaven, and on earth peace to those on whom his favor rests." It is a miraculous thing. Think about this. The angels show up. They don't bring Mary a bed. She's laying in a bundle of straw in a stable somewhere. They don't bring Jesus a bassinet. Jesus, the God in front of whom they constantly are in awe. And here he is lying in a manger. And they don't bring him a bassinet. They bring him praise. They bring him worship. They bring him adoration. The angels who look and say, "I can't believe the God who created all this would agree to come down and take on the form of sinful humanity." And so they worship. See, worship simply means to ascribe worth or value to someone or something. So to worship God is anytime you turn your heart towards God, thinking about his goodness, his love, his majesty. Anytime you turn your heart in trust towards God, you're worshiping him. And you're thinking in awe about who he is, his grace, his forgiveness. You can worship God when you're reading the Bible. You can worship God traditionally. We think of it during singing. But worship can happen when you're just simply meditating on or pondering who God is. Worship can happen in any place. Worship can happen in your living room or in a boardroom. Worship can happen in a car or in a church. It can happen in your school or in a sanctuary. Worship can happen anywhere. Now, here's the amazing thing about worship. If worship is about assigning worth, ascribing value to someone or something, here's the amazing reality. And it doesn't matter what your belief system is. It doesn't matter if you're a Christian, not a Christian, if you're considering Christianity, or if you hate all things God. We all worship. There is no human being who does not worship. It's not a question of if you will worship. It's a question of what you will worship or who you will worship. See, when you trust anyone or anything to bring meaning to your life, you end up worshiping it. What is it that you trust to bring meaning, value, stability, safety to your life? Is it your reputation? Is it your education? Is it your portfolio? Is it your career? Is it your financial holdings? Is it the people in your life? A husband, a wife, children? Is it some form of entertainment and recreation? Is it your own ingenuity that you trust in? Or do you trust in the God who created everything and say, "I will place my trust squarely on God. And as I trust in him to bring meaning to my life, as you trust in him to bring meaning to your life, you will end up worshiping him." So we're all going to worship something. We're all going to worship someone. The question is, who or what are you going to worship? And so really when we talk about the idea that God came in the form of Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, my question for you as we start out the message this morning is simple. This Christmas, will you embrace the wonder of worship? This Christmas, will you set aside time in the Christmas cheer, in the Christmas traditions, in exchanging gifts and going to parties and eating more food than you ought to eat and packing on more calories than you ever intended? In all of that, in all the joy and the laughter and the fun, will you take time to embrace the wonder of worship, to give the gift of worship, to stand back in awe at a God who came not just for all of humanity, but he did. But he came for you, personally. If you were the only one that ever breathed, Jesus still would have come for you. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, in the joy of the Christmas season, sure, I'll embrace the wonder of worship. But Pastor, you don't understand. I don't have joy this Christmas season. My Christmas is more tearful than cheerful. My Christmas is not full of joy and laughter and Yuletide. This is just muck and yuck. It's not a joyful Christmas. I am looking for the holidays to be over. I'm not looking forward to the holidays. I'm more looking forward to December 26th than December 25th because life isn't where I expected it to be. Things have happened. I'm facing some things. I'm going through some things, and it's not what I wanted. It's not what I expected. And everything I see around me reminds me of not the joy of Christmas. What is there to worship? But the pain that I'm facing. I see parents with their kids, and it reminds me of the empty crib in my life. I see people going to mom and dad's house, having all these family pictures, posting all this stuff on social media. I see all that, and I'm reminded that there are about 50 degrees of separation between me and my loved ones. I've been abandoned. I've been cast out. I'm not welcome there, and there's distance, and it hurts. I see everyone going to Christmas parties and having fun and doing all this stuff, and I'm reminded of the loneliness I feel in my heart. I may be invited to the parties, but I can feel, and I do feel alone in a room of 50 people. And so I'm not looking forward to the holidays. I'm looking forward to the holidays to be over. Here's the amazing thing. That's exactly what Mary felt. Mary felt exactly like that on that very first Christmas. Here she was, miles away from her family. I mean, separated from her family. She was looked down upon. She was disgraced. Nobody believed her. She's pregnant. Normally, you're pregnant with your first child. Everybody's excited. They all thought she has committed fornication. She had sex outside of marriage. They weren't excited for her. They all thought it was Joseph's child, except Joseph, who knew it wasn't his child because he knew he hadn't had any type of sexual relationship with Mary. So he says, I'm going to send her away. It took God sending an angel to keep Joseph from sending Mary away. And so here she is. She gives birth to Jesus. She's in a stable somewhere. She's tired. She's sore. She's in pain. No midwife to help, no mom, no doting relatives. It's her and Joseph alone, scared, uncertain. And she thinks to herself, this isn't how I expected this to go. Like 10 months ago, an angel shows up and says, "Hail to you, O favored one of God." This doesn't feel like God's favor. This feels like maybe God's punishment. I mean, if God was happy with me, why would I give birth to a baby in a manger? This doesn't make sense. But as she lay there and she held in her hand the God who flung the stars into the sky, and she looks at his little feet, the feet that walked the cosmos and later on would walk on water, when she looks at him, the ache in her heart and the ache in her body begins to melt away. And what does she do at that moment? she worships. This is what it says later on in Luke. Mary treasured up these things in her heart and pondered them in her heart. She treasured them up. She pondered them. She reflected on them. She meditated on them. That is worship. God, I can't believe this. God, this is amazing. Here I hold in my hands, not just flesh and blood, but the God who created everything. I don't even understand this. I know he came out of me. I know he's part of me. I know he's fully human, but I know at the same time he's fully divine. And she stood there in worship. So here's what I want to say to you. If you're going to embrace the wonder of worship this Christmas, here's the first thing you need to do. Worship privately the God who can use you despite your circumstances. Worship, listen, private worship is powerful worship. There's times when it's just you and God. You're driving in the car, you're taking a walk, you're sitting on the chair somewhere, you're by yourself and you feel there's no one there, and you still turn your face, turn your heart, turn your trust to God and begin to praise him, begin to worship him. It changes things. The pain in your heart, the hurt, the feeling like this isn't where I wanted my life to be. I've been lied to, I've been lied about. I didn't want any of this. It all melts away as you place your trust in a God who can use you. He can use you despite your circumstances. There are some people who think God can never use me because of where I am. No, God knows exactly where you are. And he says, I can use you exactly where you are, if you'll turn to him in worship. But that's not the only way that we can embrace the wonder of worship. There's a second way, and it's incredible. It's recorded for us in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, if you read Matthew's account of the birth of Jesus, it starts with a long list of names. We often don't read all the names, and for your benefit, we're not going to read them all now. It's 16 verses of names. But it starts like this, Matthew 1, chapter 1. This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the Christ, the anointed one. He is the son of David, the son of Abraham. And it goes on to list his lineage, his genealogy. This person was the parent of this person, was the parent of this person. There's a reason that Matthew lists those names. There's a lot of reasons. One of them is to lay out the truth that Jesus had a claim to the throne of David, that he was a rightful heir of the throne. He was in the lineage of King David. So he had a right to say, I am the king. So that's part of it. But there's another part. The part that says, despite... See, I don't know if you know this, but Jesus' family tree is pretty crooked. It's pretty gnarled. It is not, it's not one that most of us would be proud of. And yet Matthew lists it. And the reason he lists it is because he wants us to know that despite the past, God can use you. So he goes on. I just want to read this one section in Matthew. Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, so this is a list. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. So we see Rahab, Ruth, David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife, and Solomon, the father of Rehoboam. Now, you say, I don't know those names. They don't mean anything to me. Well, let me give you some insight. Rahab was a harlot. Ruth was an immigrant. She wasn't even a Jew. Then you've got David, who was an adulterer. He was Solomon, Uriah's wife. Was the wife of Uriah. David had Uriah killed so he could marry his wife Bathsheba. So David was an adulterer and a murderer. And then he had a son named Solomon. Solomon was a philanderer. Solomon had hundreds of wives, thousands of concubines. And then he ends up turning away from the Lord later in his life and worships false gods. And then it lists Solomon's son, Rehoboam. Rehoboam, he is the last king to rule over a united Israel before their civil war. And he is so foolish, so arrogant, so unwise that he sets up a line of bloodthirsty, hateful, vengeful kings that eventually lead to the kingdom of Israel being torn in two and being sent on to exile. He had counselors who said, do this. And he doesn't listen to them. He listens to his own wisdom and his own insight and to his friends who he thought knew better than the wisdom of the aged. Listen to old people. They know a lot. You say, I don't know old people. You're looking at one. If you say you're young, well, then I'll come to you. But no, there's wisdom in that. So what is that telling us? That in all these things, that you can and you should worship as a family the God who can use you despite your past. See, worship privately, absolutely. But this Christmas, if you want to embrace the wonder of worship, worship as a family. Take time to meditate, think on, stand in awe of the goodness of God, sing Christmas songs together, read passages from the Bible together, come in times of worship as a family, the God who can use you despite your past. See, every family has a past. And most families that have things in their past that they're ashamed of never talk about them. But God says, I'm going to list it all. I'm going to list it all for everyone to see, because that's how you know God can use you. If you think everyone's got this pristine, perfect, neat, military corner, everything's perfect past, then you miss and you say, but that's not my past. So you need to share those things. Share it with your kids, share it with your grandkids, share it with the people in your life. Say, let me tell you what God has done. So in my life, and I've shared this story before, I'll share it again. I'm not going to get into all the nitty-gritty details, but at 19 years old, I fell in love with this wonderful woman, Jamie Bendinelli. That's Italian, in case you didn't know. We fell in love, we started dating, and we allowed biology to override the voice of the Holy Spirit. And right around Christmas time in 1993, she was home from Christmas, for Christmas break in 1993, we found out she was pregnant. We weren't married. We wanted to get married. And listen, I was getting ready to go off to college in January to get my degree in pastoral ministry. That's kind of a hard way to start out. Hey, so I didn't end up going to school. We ended up getting married later on in the next year. And our oldest child was born in August of that year. She is now 27. We've been married now over 27 years. And God has used our past, or despite our past, God has used us. He's redeemed that. We're so proud of her. We love her with everything in us. She has given us our first grandson, and he is an amazing kid, and we just think he's the greatest. And if you disagree with me, I can prove it to you. As a matter of fact, I have some slides. No, and despite our past, I can stand here today as a pastor, not because I did everything right, but because God can use me, can use you, can use anyone despite your past. But you have to turn to him in worship, in trust, in adoration, and say, God, I know what I've done, and I'm sorry. Please forgive me. I don't want to be that person anymore. This doesn't mean just live any way you want and say, God will use me. In the midst of our sin, in the midst of what we've done, we did some serious repenting. We stood in front of our church. We didn't have to. We wanted to. We stood in front of our church and said, we did this and we're wrong. We need your help. We need your support. We need your love. We don't need your condemnation. We don't need your hate. We don't need your gossip. And that church rallied around us and loved us and supported us because we humbled ourselves. So God can use you despite your past, but you have to turn to him in worship and embrace the wonder of worship. God, you can use me. But there's a third way that you can embrace the wonder of worship this Christmas. And this is something that's easily overlooked. So in Luke, right, so the angel shows up, tells the shepherds, hey, this has happened. Then this group of angels show up. They all start worshiping. It's just amazing. They fill the whole night with worship. The shepherds run off. They say, we got to check this thing out that has been told to us. So they go, they find Mary and the baby just as the angel described. And then after they see the baby Jesus, this is what it says. It says the shepherds returned. What were they doing? Glorifying and praising God for all the things they had heard and seen, which were just as they had been told. In other words, they didn't worship privately. They weren't a family. They worshiped corporately. The angels, right? That one angel was there, but then it was a multitude of angels. The angels worshiped corporately. There is something powerful when we come together in worship. So the third way that you can embrace worship is worship in community, the God who can use you despite what's happening around you. In a world full of chaos, Jesus came. The world was as confused then as it is now. We think, oh, it's worse than it's ever been. It's just our time. Every generation has always said that. I know no generation who says, wow, this is better than it's ever been. You know, they had it really bad, and they're going to have it bad in the future, but I'm living in the sweet time, the perfect time. No, everybody says, oh, man, I wish it was the good old days. But the good old days weren't, as Billy Joel said, always good. And tomorrow ain't as bad as it seems. Sorry. No, what I'm saying is this. We live in trying times. The shepherds lived in trying times. They were under Roman occupation. They had very few rights, very few liberties, very few freedoms. And yet, despite that, they worship God. Despite what's happening around you, you can worship God. There is something powerful when you worship in community. Listen to me. I know that there are those who have said, we don't need church. But I just want you to know, throughout 2,000 years of church history, there have always been those who have said, we don't need church. Here's the amazing thing. 2,000 some years later, the church still endures because God has chosen to work through the church. That's God's plan. He's going to work through the church. What's sad to me is those who say we don't need corporate church. They lose out and we lose out. They lose out on the power of corporate worship. They lose out on the power of a shared vision. They lose out on those who will care for them spiritually and speak truth when they get into error. And we lose out on their gifts, on their presence, on what they can contribute, on the thoughts, the ideas that they can bring to a church body. But make no mistake, there is something profound and powerful that happens when we worship in community. Something powerful happens when you worship, especially in community. In 1915, just outside the village of Laventie, France, in northern France, with World War I raging on, bombs shaking the ground, trench warfare, horrible type of warfare raging on Christmas Eve, 1915, something incredible, something amazing happened. See, you had German soldiers on one side entrenched. You had the Royal Welsh Fusiliers on the other side. And on this night, these men, and most of these men were just a few years removed from boyhood. They were young, and they were homesick, miles from family, and Christmas seemed forever away. But as they stood there, firing across the battlefield, the German soldiers began to sing an old Welsh hymn, a song of praise, a song of worship. And as that song carried across the battlefield, the Welsh soldiers heard those words. And with no prompting from any leaders, no orders coming down, both sides stopped firing and began to worship. And through the night, they sang across the battlefield songs of worship, songs of joy, songs that talked about the coming of Christ. And their voices were joined together from one side of the battlefield to the other. As dawn broke on that Christmas morning, the feelings of goodwill, thoughts of peace on earth emboldened the hearts of the soldiers, so much so that they set down their firearms, walked out of their trenches, and approached one another. They began to shake hands to greet their foes. And in doing that, something happened. They began to see each other not as the enemy, but as friends. They began to exchange whatever gifts they had. The German soldiers were gracious enough to give them beer and bratwurst and sausage. The Welsh soldiers were evil enough to give them canned corned beef and biscuits, different buttons from their uniforms, helmets. And spontaneously, a soccer game just began to play, not proper soccer. I mean, this was like 50 guys playing a makeshift game of soccer, and they just played and laughed and had fun. And for that moment, as brief as that moment was, a battlefield became a playground. Why? It all started with worship. It all started with people coming together, turning their eyes from themselves, their focus from anything around them, not putting their trust in a firearm, but putting their trust in Jesus, who was King. Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us. See, one day lasting peace will come. But until then, worship God. Until then, embrace the wonder of worship. See, Jesus came. Jesus came, Emmanuel, God with us, came despite the past, despite the circumstances, despite the situation going on in the world, despite what they would say about him and about Mary, his mother, and Joseph, his earthly father, despite everything that would ever be said about him, Jesus came. What does that tell us? It tells us that nothing could keep Christ from entering the world. That is how you embrace the wonder of worship. When you say nothing can keep Christ from entering into my situation. Regardless of my past, regardless of my circumstances, regardless of the situation of what's happening all around me in the world today, nothing can keep God from moving. When you do that, you worship in a way that something powerful happens. So I want to end with a couple verses from Psalm 11. It says this. David's writing. He says, when the foundations are being destroyed, what can the righteous do? What David's saying is what so many of us feel at different points in life. When everything is falling apart, what can I do? When my marriage is falling apart, what can I do? When my family is crumbling, what can I do? When I'm looking at a pink slip instead of a promotion, what can I do? When I'm facing bankruptcy, what can I do? When I've been lied to and lied about, what can I do? What can the righteous do? What are we to do when life isn't going the way we want? When we're like Mary and say, I thought I was favored of God. This doesn't feel like favor. What are we to do? Now, it's amazing what David's response to his own question is, because he doesn't actually answer the question. He doesn't give an explanation. He gives a declaration. And what he says is this: the Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord is on his heavenly throne. He says, when life isn't going the way you want, when everything is falling apart, hold on to the one who is unchanging, unswerving, the same yesterday, today, and forever, the God who is still on his throne. Turn to him, trust in him, worship him. Cling to him when you're standing in front of a tombstone. Cling to him when you're standing in the emergency room. Cling to him when you're holding the doctor's report. Cling to him when everyone has walked away from you. Cling to him regardless of anything that's happening. Trust in him. Turn to him. The Lord is still on his throne. That is what it means to embrace the wonder of worship. And if you'll do that, I promise you, something amazing will happen in your life. It may be an external thing. God may move supernaturally, provide, bring someone into your life. He may simply transform you from the inside out, which really is a greater thing, isn't it? That God would say, I'm shifting in your life what it is that you find and place, and who you find and place your trust in. No longer on a person, no longer on a reputation, no longer on a situation, no longer on having this or not having that, or being here or not being there. You have placed your trust in me. When you embrace the wonder of worship, what you'll find is this: nothing can keep Christ from entering your world. Nothing. In your world of hard work and high stress, in your world where things are difficult, where you're struggling, or in your world where everything is great and merry and cheerful, my question for you is, will you embrace the wonder of worship this Christmas so that Christ can invade your life like never before? So if that's you, here's what I'm going to ask right where you are in just the next moment. If you say, I want to embrace the wonder of worship, then I just want you in just a moment to stand to your feet. We're going to sing a song. We're going to sing a song that declares, praise the name of the Lord our God. So if you just right now close your eyes. Heavenly Father, I ask you right now, if that is on our heart, to embrace the wonder of worship, whether it be privately, whether as a family, and here now as a community of believers. God, if that's our heart, if that's our desire, God, would you give us the boldness in these next few moments to engage in worship like we never have before. Not just to stand and sing words, but God, to engage soul, mind, spirit, strength, to raise our hands, to clap, to lift our voices, to kneel if we need to kneel, to come to the altar if we need to come to the altar. But God, to come into your presence, to turn our face and our trust and our hearts towards you. Because when we do, oh God, when we do, something amazing happens. So now, if that's you, if you mean it, if you say, I'm going to embrace the wonder of worship this holiday season, this Christmas. If you're online, click the button that's going to show up in the chat. If not, right now where you are, stand to your feet and let's worship God together.